So it's been just over a year since my first video on modes came out, and I recently received a comment by a viewer saying that they know the modes off by heart but struggle to compose using them. Well, after falling down the rabbit hole a little, I've climbed back out and I've decided to cover this topic in a bit more detail, talking about each mode, how I approach them when writing, and then composing an example in each of them. As I obviously felt this wasn't enough to get on with, I've also explained one or two other compositional techniques that I've used in these pieces to give you a few more ideas on how to approach them. To make this information a little more digestible, and because the video would be massive otherwise, I've decided to cut this video into multiple parts. Links to the other videos in this series will be in the description, pinned in the comments, and in a card in the top right of this video. Now let's get on with it. The Songwriter's Guide for Writing in a Mode, Part 1. Caveats. Before we get into the modes, I'd like to mention a few caveats as well as a few general pieces of advice to consider when writing music. Caveat number 1. These are just the techniques that I find most helpful. Some of these may be useful for you, but don't worry if they aren't. Everyone has techniques that work for them and techniques that don't. Caveat number 2. While most of the time you may naturally follow the rules, sometimes breaking the rules just works and you might not know why. Rules in music are more like guidelines anyway, and often when you think you're breaking the rules, there's probably another rule that explains why what you've written works. I'd say to learn as many techniques as you can so you know when you want to break them. Caveat number 3. These techniques are mostly based around rock and pop, as these are the styles of music I tend to write in and listen to, so some of these techniques may not translate to other types of music. General advice. Before I get on to the individual modes themselves, I thought it would be wise to mention a few general tips for the modes that I think are worth thinking about. The first of these goes for whenever I'm writing and is repetition legitimizes. Repetition is sometimes a dirty word in music and really shouldn't be. Repeating a melody, rhythm, or riff is what helps build the groundwork for your piece, and it doesn't just mean repeating the same melody over and over, it can be rhythmically as well. A friend of mine always said if you play the wrong notes once, then it's a mistake. If you play it 5 times, it's on purpose. A more specific piece of advice for modes would be to think about how obvious or subtle you want it to be that you're writing in a mode. If you want it to be obvious, use the notes in the mode that are different to major or minor in your melody, or as the roots of your chords. If you want it to be more subtle, maybe avoid these notes and let them appear in your piece as part of the chords you're playing. Thirdly, ideas and melodies don't always come straight away. Often the best way to come up with ideas is to mess around in them, play the scale and jump around to different notes in it, playing different chords and rhythms. And if you come up with an idea, always make a note of it, whether that means typing it into Logic or Ableton or just recording a voice memo. Always keep a hold of it, as you never know when that idea might become useful. Ionian, sevenths and slash chords. So the first mode we're going to start with, naturally, is Ionian. When working on this track, I wanted to go for an acoustic pop sound, using drums, U-bass, acoustic guitar, and an electric guitar tone inspired by artists like the Isley Brothers or Gary Moore. As said in the previous video, Ionian is, for all intents and purposes, identical to major in intervals and usage, so the techniques I'm going to talk about here also apply to major in general. Something that can be worth considering when writing in any scale, but especially major or Ionian, is functional harmony. To keep it simple, functional harmony is the idea that every chord in a scale has a job or function, the most important of these being the root, where the song is at rest. The dominant that directs the listener back to the root with a strong resolution, and the subdominant that fills a similar role to the dominant but with a weaker resolution. Now there's a lot more to it than that. In fact, I accidentally wrote 2 pages of script explaining functional harmony in detail, which I had to cut to avoid making this video ridiculously long. So maybe I'll talk about that in a future video. In this example, I've decided to ascend up the chords of the major scale until I reach the subdominant, using this to direct me back to the root chord. Another great set of tools to use when songwriting are 7th chords. 7th chords are chords that, rather than just including a root, 3rd and 5th, also contain a 7th. The most common of these are the major 7th, a major chord that contains a major 7th, a dominant 7th, a major chord that contains a minor or dominant 7th, and the minor seventh, a minor chord that contains a minor or dominant seventh. These chords are often used to add more flavour to a chord sequence, with the dominant seventh also containing a functional role we'll discuss later. In this example, I decided to make each of the chords in the sequence their seventh chord counterpart, adding a bit more flavour to the sequence. The last technique I'll talk about in relation to this example is slash chords. A slash chord is a chord that contains a different note as its root, indicated by putting a slash next to the chord and writing the note next to it. This can help give the chord a more ambiguous centre, allow the bass line to move more smoothly, or imply a different chord than being played. In this example, I decided to keep the first of the scale as the root through the first three chords, changing to the actual root on the fourth chord to emphasise the chord more in the progression. Having heard all that, let's see how it turns out. Thanks for giving this video a watch. Links to the other videos in the series will be in the description, pinned in the comments, and in a card in the top right of the video. If you have any comments on this video or suggestions for future videos, let me know and I'll be sure to consider them.